Reverend Charles Jackson hummed a low, soulful tune as he carried boxes into his new apartment. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The space was small, but it felt right. After years of living in a cramped parsonage, the extra room felt like a luxury. He'd spent weeks searching for the perfect place, somewhere quiet and peaceful, a sanctuary where he could retreat after long days tending to his flock at the St. Michael's Church. This modest apartment, nestled in a quiet residential building on the edge of town, seemed to promise just that. He carefully placed a framed photograph of his family on the mantelpiece. His wife, Mary, smiled back at him, her eyes sparkling with the same warmth that had guided him through life's trials. He missed her terribly. Her passing a year ago had left a void in his heart that only faith and his community could begin to fill. He straightened his back, a familiar ache in his lower back a reminder of the years spent kneeling in prayer. He was 62, but his spirit felt young, invigorated by the prospect of a fresh start. The building itself was unremarkable, a 3-story brick structure with faded paint and slightly overgrown ivy clinging to its walls. It wasn't grand, but it possessed a quiet dignity, a sense of settled permanence that appealed to him. He'd already met a few of his neighbors, mostly elderly couples, who greeted him with cautious smiles and polite nods. They seemed like good people, the kind who kept to themselves but were always willing to lend a helping hand. A loud cough from the hallway startled him. He turned to see a man standing at his door, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze unwavering. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face etched with lines that spoke of a life lived outdoors, under the relentless sun. His hair was the color of faded straw, and his eyes, though kind, held a certain hardness, a guardedness that hinted at unspoken burdens. This was Mr. Abernathy, the landlord, his presence as sturdy and unyielding as the brick building itself. "Reverend Jackson?" Mr. Abernathy's voice was gruff, almost gravelly, but not unkind. "Yes, that's right," Reverend Jackson replied, extending his hand. Mr. Abernathy's handshake was firm, his grip surprisingly strong. "I am Silas Abernathy. Welcome to the building." His gaze swept over the apartment, taking in the unpacked boxes and the scattered furniture. There was a brief silence, a moment of unspoken observation. "Thank you," Reverend Jackson said, feeling a slight unease under the landlord's scrutinizing stare. "I hope I won't be any trouble." "Trouble?" Mr. Abernathy chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Not as long as you pay your rent on time. This building's seen its share of tenants, good and bad, but mostly quiet, thankfully." He paused, his eyes lingering on the photograph of Reverend Jackson's family. "Lost someone, I see." Reverend Jackson nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "My wife, Mary. A year ago." A flicker of something akin to empathy crossed Mr. Abernathy's face, a brief softening of the harsh lines around his eyes. "My condolences," he murmured, his voice softer now. "Losing someone, it leaves a hole you can't fill." "Indeed," Reverend Jackson agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He felt a strange connection with this man, a shared understanding of loss and the quiet resilience required to navigate grief. "Well," Mr. Abernathy said, clearing his throat, "I'll leave you to it. Let me know if you need anything. And remember, rent's due the 1st of the month." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the hallway, leaving Reverend Jackson to unpack his life in the quiet solitude of his new home. The encounter left a strange impression. Mr. Abernathy was a man of few words, but his eyes hinted at a depth of feeling that belied his gruff exterior. Reverend Jackson hoped that, despite the initial awkwardness, he could build a respectful relationship with his landlord. He needed peace, and he hoped this new beginning would bring just that. Reverend Jackson spent the next few days settling into his new apartment. He unpacked his belongings, arranging his books and mementos with a careful hand. He hung a cross above his small writing desk, a silent testament to his faith, and placed a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, a splash of vibrant color against the muted tones of the brick building. He found a small, quiet joy in the simple act of creating a home, a sanctuary where he could find peace and solace. He also began to engage with his neighbors. He introduced himself to the elderly couple across the hall, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, sharing a warm smile and a brief conversation about the neighborhood. He learned that Mr. Henderson was a retired carpenter, his hands still bearing the marks of years spent shaping wood, while Mrs. Henderson was a keen gardener, her small balcony overflowing with colorful blooms. They were kind, welcoming, and their quiet contentment seemed to reflect the peaceful atmosphere of the building. He also met Mrs. Gable, a lively woman who lived 2 floors down, known for her delicious apple pies and her even more delicious gossip. She regaled him with tales of past tenants, their quirks and idiosyncrasies, painting a vibrant picture of the building's history. While her stories were often exaggerated, her warmth and genuine interest in her neighbors were undeniable. But it was Mrs. Abernathy, Silas Abernathy's mother, who captivated Reverend Jackson's attention. He saw her occasionally in the hallway, a frail figure with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her movements slow and deliberate. She always carried a worn book, her eyes often lost in its pages. There was a quiet dignity about her, a gentle strength that resonated with him. He noticed that she often sat by the window of her apartment, gazing out at the street below, a wistful expression on her face. One afternoon, as he was returning from a grocery run, he saw her struggling to carry a heavy bag of groceries. Without hesitation, he approached her, offering his assistance. She looked up, surprised, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized him. "Oh, Reverend Jackson," she said, her voice soft and slightly trembling. "Thank you so much. This bag is heavier than it looks." He took the bag from her, his hand brushing against hers. Her skin was paper-thin, her touch surprisingly delicate. He felt a sudden pang of empathy, a sense of shared vulnerability. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Abernathy," he replied, his voice gentle. "It's always a kindness to help one's neighbor." They walked together to her apartment, exchanging pleasantries along the way. He learned that she was a retired librarian, a lover of books and quiet contemplation. She spoke of her late husband, her voice filled with a bittersweet nostalgia. He listened patiently, offering words of comfort and understanding. He felt a connection with her, a shared understanding of loss and the enduring power of memory. As he helped her unpack her groceries, he noticed a small, worn photograph on her kitchen table. It depicted a younger Silas Abernathy, a boy with bright, curious eyes, standing proudly next to his mother. The resemblance was striking, yet the boy's cheerful expression was starkly different from the grim countenance of the man Reverend Jackson had met. The contrast spoke volumes about the weight of years and the burdens of life. That evening, as he sat in his own apartment, a quiet sense of purpose settled over him. He felt a growing desire to connect with Mrs. Abernathy on a deeper level, to offer her the comfort and solace that his faith allowed him to provide. He sensed a loneliness in her, a quiet sadness that he felt compelled to address. He knew instinctively that his relationship with Mrs. Abernathy was only just beginning. Over the next few weeks, Reverend Jackson became a regular visitor to Mrs. Abernathy's apartment. He would stop by most afternoons, often bringing a small gift, a bouquet of flowers from his garden, a freshly baked loaf of bread from the bakery down the street, or simply a cup of warm tea. He would find her sitting by her window, her gaze lost in the distance, or sometimes engrossed in a book, her thin fingers tracing the lines of the text. He didn't pry into her life, but he listened attentively when she chose to share. He learned that she was battling a chronic illness, a slow, relentless disease that was gradually weakening her body. She spoke of her pain, her fear, and her acceptance of her fate with a quiet dignity that filled Reverend Jackson with both admiration and sorrow. He offered her spiritual comfort, sharing stories from the Bible, reading passages that spoke of hope, faith, and the promise of eternal life. He prayed with her, his voice a gentle murmur in the quiet apartment, his words a balm to her troubled soul. He didn't impose his beliefs, but he offered solace, a refuge from the pain and uncertainty that clouded her days. He also shared stories from his own life, tales of his childhood, his marriage to Mary, and his ministry. He spoke of the joys and sorrows of his life, his triumphs and failures, his faith and his doubts. He shared his experiences with an openness and vulnerability that drew Mrs. Abernathy into his confidence. She listened intently, her eyes reflecting the warmth of his words. In return, she shared snippets of her own life, memories of her youth, her love for her husband, and her passion for books. She spoke of her experiences as a librarian, the countless stories she had shared with readers, and the profound impact that books had had on her life. She spoke of her son, Silas, with a mixture of pride and concern, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. Their conversations were not always about faith or illness. Sometimes they simply shared quiet moments of companionship, sipping tea and gazing out the window at the passing world. They discussed the weather, the changing seasons, the beauty of the flowers blooming in the neighborhood. They talked about books, sharing their favorite authors and stories. They laughed together, their laughter a fragile, precious sound in the quiet apartment. Reverend Jackson's visits were not just acts of charity. They were acts of connection, of shared humanity. He saw in Mrs. Abernathy not just a frail, elderly woman battling illness, but a strong, resilient soul grappling with life's challenges. He saw in her a reflection of his own faith, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. He was drawn to her quiet dignity, her unwavering faith, and her gentle acceptance of her fate. He found solace in her presence, a sense of shared humanity that transcended the boundaries of age, illness, and social standing. He knew that his visits were as much a source of comfort for him as they were for her. He found in her a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler on life's journey. The visits continued, evolving from simple acts of kindness into something deeper, a quiet friendship forged in shared experiences and mutual respect. Reverend Jackson found himself looking forward to his afternoons with Mrs. Abernathy, a sense of anticipation warming his heart. He no longer simply offered comfort. He shared his life with her, and in turn, she shared hers with him, revealing aspects of her personality and history that he hadn't initially glimpsed. He learned about her love for classical music, and he would often bring recordings of her favorite composers, filling her apartment with the soothing melodies of Bach and Mozart. He learned about her passion for gardening, and he would help her tend to the few plants she kept on her balcony, her frail hands carefully tending to the delicate blossoms. He learned about her keen intellect, her sharp wit, and her dry sense of humor, all hidden beneath a veneer of quiet reserve. Their conversations became more intimate, delving into deeper topics: faith, life, death, and the mysteries of the universe. He listened to her stories of her life, her childhood memories, her marriage, and her son, Silas. He learned about her hopes and dreams, her regrets and disappointments, and her unwavering faith in God's plan. He learned about the complexities of her relationship with Silas, a mixture of love, concern, and unspoken tensions. He became a source of strength and peace during her difficult time. He helped her navigate the emotional and physical challenges of her illness, offering practical assistance and unwavering support. He helped her with her correspondence, reading her letters and writing responses on her behalf. He helped her manage her finances, ensuring that she had access to the resources she needed. He helped her maintain her dignity and independence, ensuring that she remained connected to the world around her. Their bond deepened beyond simple companionship. He became her confidant, her advisor, her friend. She confided in him about her fears and anxieties, her hopes and dreams. She shared her innermost thoughts and feelings with him, trusting him with her vulnerabilities. He, in turn, shared his own struggles, his own doubts and fears, finding solace in her unwavering support. Their friendship was a testament to the power of human connection, a quiet sanctuary in the midst of life's storms. It was a bond built on mutual respect, shared experiences, and a deep understanding of each other's humanity. He saw in her a reflection of his own faith, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. And she, in turn, found in him a source of strength, a beacon of light in the darkness of her illness. Their quiet friendship was a testament to the transformative power of human connection, a beacon of hope in the face of adversity. It was a bond that transcended the boundaries of age, illness, and social standing, a friendship forged in the crucible of shared experiences and mutual respect. It was a friendship that would profoundly impact both their lives in ways neither could have foreseen. The crisp autumn air held a chill that seeped into Reverend Jackson's bones as he walked home from his afternoon visit with Mrs. Abernathy. The leaves, once vibrant hues of red and gold, were now browning and falling, mirroring the slow decline of his friend's health. He carried a small bouquet of late-blooming chrysanthemums, their cheerful yellow a stark contrast to the somber mood settling over him. He felt a growing unease, a premonition of something unpleasant looming. He reached his apartment building, the familiar brick facade seeming colder, more unwelcoming than usual. As he fumbled with his keys, a small, official-looking envelope slipped from his mailbox. He recognized the stark, impersonal typeface of the landlord's printed stationery. A wave of apprehension washed over him as he opened the envelope, his heart sinking with each word he read. It was an eviction notice. The language was curt, devoid of any warmth or compassion. It stated that his tenancy was being terminated effective immediately. The reason cited was vague, a thinly veiled pretext: failure to comply with building regulations. But Reverend Jackson knew better. He'd been a meticulous tenant, always paying his rent on time, always respectful of the building's rules. There was no legitimate reason for this eviction. A cold dread settled over him. He reread the letter, searching for a clue, a hint of explanation, anything to make sense of this sudden, brutal act. He found nothing. Only the stark reality of his impending displacement, the abrupt end to the peace and sanctuary he'd found in his new home. He felt a surge of anger, a righteous indignation that burned in his chest. This was unjust, unfair, a blatant act of discrimination. He knew, instinctively, that the reason for his eviction was not the fabricated building regulations, but something far more sinister, something rooted in prejudice and bigotry. He remembered Mr. Abernathy's gruff demeanor, his guarded gaze, the unspoken tension that had always hung between them. He recalled the subtle undercurrents of suspicion, the unspoken judgments that had clouded their interactions. He now understood the true nature of those encounters, the hidden prejudice that had festered beneath the surface. The eviction notice wasn't just a legal document. It was a personal attack, a cruel rejection fueled by hate and intolerance. It was a violation of his dignity, an assault on his sense of belonging. He felt a deep sense of betrayal, not just by Mr. Abernathy, but by the system that allowed such blatant discrimination to flourish. He felt a wave of despair, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He was a man of faith, a servant of God, yet he felt utterly powerless in the face of this injustice. He thought of Mrs. Abernathy, her frail body battling illness, her quiet dignity a testament to her strength. The thought of her vulnerability, her dependence on him, fueled his anger and his determination to fight back. He knew he couldn't simply accept this injustice. He had to fight back, not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered similar indignities, for all those who had been marginalized and discriminated against. He had to find a way to expose Mr. Abernathy's prejudice, to hold him accountable for his actions. He had to fight for his right to live in peace, to find sanctuary in his own home. The eviction notice was more than just a piece of paper. It was a battle cry, a call to action. And he would answer that call. Reverend Jackson shared his ordeal with his congregation at St. Michael's Church the following Sunday. He didn't preach a fiery sermon of condemnation, but spoke with quiet dignity, his voice trembling slightly as he recounted the events of the past few days. He spoke of the eviction notice, the fabricated reasons, and the underlying prejudice that fueled Mr. Abernathy's actions. He didn't name names, but the unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps rippled through the congregation, followed by murmurs of outrage and disbelief. Faces, usually serene during the Sunday service, were now etched with anger and indignation. The quiet sanctuary was filled with a palpable sense of injustice. After the service, people approached Reverend Jackson, offering words of support and comfort. Many shared similar stories of discrimination, their voices filled with a mixture of anger, frustration, and resignation. They spoke of subtle slights, overt acts of racism, and the systemic injustices that had plagued their community for generations. They had long endured these injustices in silence, but Reverend Jackson's experience had broken the dam, unleashing a torrent of shared pain and collective outrage. The news of Reverend Jackson's eviction spread like wildfire through the community. It wasn't just the members of St. Michael's who were affected. The entire town felt the sting of this injustice. People from all walks of life, regardless of race or creed, rallied to his support. His neighbors, the elderly couple across the hall, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, offered him temporary lodging in their spare room. Mrs. Gable, the lively woman from downstairs, organized a fundraising drive to help him find new housing. Even some of the more reserved residents, those who usually kept to themselves, expressed their solidarity, offering practical assistance and words of encouragement. A local newspaper ran a story on the eviction, highlighting the injustice and the community's response. The article sparked a wave of public outrage, attracting the attention of local activists and civil rights organizations. The story went viral online, shared and reshared on social media platforms, amplifying the community's anger and drawing attention to the issue of housing discrimination. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, a testament to the strength and resilience of the community. People offered legal assistance, financial aid, and emotional support. They organized protests and demonstrations, demanding justice for Reverend Jackson and an end to housing discrimination in the town. The local council received a flood of complaints, demanding an investigation into Mr. Abernathy's actions and the implementation of anti-discrimination policies. The initial shock and despair gave way to a sense of empowerment. The community, once divided by differences, was now united by a shared purpose: to fight for justice, to challenge injustice, and to create a more equitable society. Reverend Jackson's eviction had become a catalyst for change, a spark that ignited a flame of resistance, a symbol of the community's unwavering commitment to justice and equality. The fight for his right to housing had become a fight for the soul of the community, a battle for justice that would resonate far beyond the confines of the small town. Armed with the unwavering support of his community and a growing sense of righteous anger, Reverend Jackson decided to confront Mr. Abernathy directly. He found him in his small office, a cramped space cluttered with paperwork and dusty files, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and old wood. Mr. Abernathy sat behind a worn wooden desk, his gaze fixed on some papers, his expression unreadable. Reverend Jackson entered without knocking, his presence filling the small room. Mr. Abernathy looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized his tenant. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the silence heavy with the weight of the eviction notice. "Mr. Abernathy," Reverend Jackson began, his voice calm but firm, "I need an explanation." Mr. Abernathy remained silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. He then leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped behind his head, a smug expression playing on his lips. "Explanation for what, Reverend? Your eviction notice is quite clear." "That notice is a lie," Reverend Jackson countered, his voice rising slightly. "I've always paid my rent on time. I've always respected the rules of this building. There is no legitimate reason for my eviction." "Oh, there are reasons," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Plenty of reasons. Let's just say you're not the right fit for this building." "What does that even mean?" Reverend Jackson demanded, his voice laced with anger. "Are you saying I'm not the right fit because I'm black?" Mr. Abernathy's face hardened. He avoided direct eye contact, his gaze drifting towards the window. "I don't discriminate," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "It's just, I prefer tenants who are more familiar with the neighborhood." "That's a blatant lie," Reverend Jackson said, his voice rising. "This is discrimination, pure and simple, and I won't stand for it." "Suit yourself," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice regaining its gruffness. "You can take this to court, but you won't win. I have ways of making sure you don't." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with menace. "This building has rules, Reverend, and you've broken them." "What rules?" Reverend Jackson challenged. "Name one rule I've broken. Name one legitimate reason for my eviction." Mr. Abernathy remained silent, his gaze fixed on the papers on his desk. He knew he couldn't provide a legitimate reason. His prejudice was his only justification, and he wasn't willing to admit it, even in the face of direct accusation. "You're a coward, Mr. Abernathy," Reverend Jackson said, his voice filled with contempt. "You hide behind vague excuses, afraid to admit your bigotry. But your actions speak louder than your words, and your actions have consequences." Mr. Abernathy stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Get out," he growled, his voice thick with rage. "Get out of my office before I call the police." Reverend Jackson didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Mr. Abernathy's. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "This is just the beginning." He turned and walked out, leaving Mr. Abernathy alone in his cluttered office, the weight of his prejudice pressing down on him like a heavy stone. The confrontation had been far from satisfactory, but it had served its purpose. Reverend Jackson had made his stand, and the fight for justice was far from over. The following weeks were a blur of activity for Reverend Jackson, a whirlwind of legal consultations, community meetings, and media interviews. The fight for his housing rights had become a cause célèbre, attracting the attention of local and national media. The story of his unjust eviction had sparked a wider conversation about housing discrimination, highlighting the systemic inequalities that plagued many communities. He found himself thrust into the role of an unexpected activist, his voice amplified by the media, his message resonating with people across the country. Yet, amidst the chaos and the fight for justice, Reverend Jackson couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Abernathy from his mind. Her frail body, her quiet dignity, her unwavering faith, all these things remained etched in his memory. He visited her regularly, offering comfort and support, but her health continued to deteriorate. He knew, deep down, that her time was drawing near. Then, one cold November morning, he received a call from the hospital. Mrs. Abernathy had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news hit him hard, a wave of grief washing over him. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just for his friend, but for the quiet companionship they had shared, the bond they had forged in the face of adversity. He attended Mrs. Abernathy's funeral, a small, intimate gathering of family and friends. He stood by Silas Abernathy, his landlord, his face etched with grief and remorse. Silas stood stiffly, his eyes red and swollen, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his sorrow. He looked older, wearier, his usual gruffness replaced by a profound sadness. Reverend Jackson felt a pang of sympathy for the man, a flicker of understanding for the pain he was enduring. After the service, Silas approached Reverend Jackson, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," he said, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "Thank you for everything you did for my mother." Reverend Jackson placed a comforting hand on Silas's shoulder. "She was a remarkable woman," he replied, his voice filled with genuine affection. "It was my honor to know her." Silas remained silent for a moment, then turned and walked away, leaving Reverend Jackson alone amidst the mourners. He watched Silas walk away, his shoulders slumped, his gait heavy with grief. He wondered about the man, the weight of his sorrow, the burden of his loss. He knew that Silas's grief was compounded by the guilt of his actions, the injustice he had inflicted on Reverend Jackson. That evening, alone in his temporary lodgings, Reverend Jackson reflected on Mrs. Abernathy's life and death. He thought about her quiet dignity, her unwavering faith, and the profound impact she had had on his life. He thought about Silas, his grief, his remorse, and the possibility of redemption. He knew that Silas's journey of grief would be a long and difficult one, but he also knew that it held the potential for profound change, a transformation that could lead to healing and reconciliation. He prayed for Silas, for his healing, for his forgiveness, and for the possibility of a future where justice and compassion would prevail. The funeral arrangements were a blur of activity for Silas Abernathy. He was overwhelmed by the practical details, the funeral home, the flowers, the obituary, all while grappling with the profound grief of losing his mother. He felt a crushing weight of loneliness, a void in his life that he didn't know how to fill. His mother had been his anchor, his connection to a past that he now felt slipping away. Her death had left him adrift, lost in a sea of sorrow and regret. He had barely spoken to anyone since her passing, retreating into his own world of grief and self-recrimination. The eviction of Reverend Jackson, a decision he now bitterly regretted, weighed heavily on his conscience. He had acted out of prejudice, a blind, irrational fear of the other, a fear that had blinded him to the kindness and compassion that had been offered to his mother in her final days. As he stood amidst the mourners at the funeral home, arranging the flowers, a familiar face caught his eye. He saw Reverend Jackson, standing near the back of the room, his expression somber but peaceful. A wave of recognition washed over Silas, a sudden jolt of clarity that pierced through the fog of his grief. He remembered the kind visitor who had frequently visited his mother, offering comfort and companionship during her illness. He remembered the gentle voice, the comforting presence, the unwavering kindness that had eased his mother's suffering. He had dismissed the visitor as just another well-meaning stranger, a fleeting presence in his mother's life. But now, looking at Reverend Jackson, he realized the truth. The visitor, the man who had offered solace and spiritual comfort to his dying mother, was the same man he had unjustly evicted from his apartment. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, agonizing truth that shattered his carefully constructed defenses. He felt a wave of shame, a crushing weight of guilt that threatened to suffocate him. He watched Reverend Jackson as he spoke to other mourners, his words gentle and compassionate, his presence a source of comfort to those around him. Silas observed the quiet dignity of the man, the unwavering faith that radiated from him. He saw the kindness, the compassion, the empathy that he had so carelessly dismissed, the qualities that had been so evident in his interactions with his mother. The contrast between his own actions and Reverend Jackson's kindness was stark and painful. He had acted out of prejudice, out of fear, out of ignorance. He had rejected the kindness and compassion that had been offered to his mother, the very qualities that had sustained her during her final days. He had shown his mother's visitor nothing but cruelty and injustice. The weight of his actions bore down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and remorse. He felt a deep sense of shame, a profound regret for the harm he had caused. He knew that he had to make amends, to seek forgiveness, to find a way to reconcile with the man he had so unjustly wronged. The funeral arrangements became a secondary concern, overshadowed by the overwhelming weight of his realization. He had to find a way to confront Reverend Jackson, to apologize for his actions, to seek his forgiveness. The path to reconciliation would be long and difficult, but Silas knew, deep down, that it was the only path towards healing and redemption. The weight of his realization pressed down on Silas Abernathy like a physical burden. He stood amidst the mourners at the funeral, the hushed whispers and murmured condolences fading into a dull background hum. His eyes remained fixed on Reverend Jackson, a figure both familiar and strangely alien. He was the kind stranger, the compassionate visitor who had brought solace to his mother's final days, the man he had so cruelly evicted from his apartment. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He had judged Reverend Jackson based on superficial assumptions, on unfounded prejudices, on a deep-seated fear of the other. He had allowed his bigotry to blind him to the kindness and compassion that had been offered to his own mother. He had rejected the very qualities that had sustained his mother during her final moments. Shame washed over him, a tidal wave of self-recrimination that threatened to drown him. He felt the full weight of his actions, the injustice he had inflicted, the cruelty he had shown. He had acted out of ignorance, out of fear, out of a deep-seated prejudice that he had never fully examined. Now, confronted with the truth, he felt the full force of his own hypocrisy. He had always prided himself on his independence, his self-reliance, his ability to stand on his own 2 feet. Yet, in his moment of greatest need, he had been sustained by the kindness of a stranger, a kindness he had repaid with cruelty and injustice. The irony was unbearable. He thought of his mother's final days, the quiet moments of peace and comfort that Reverend Jackson had provided. He remembered the gentle prayers, the comforting words, the unwavering support that had eased his mother's suffering. He remembered the warmth and compassion that had radiated from Reverend Jackson, a stark contrast to his own cold, uncaring demeanor. He had been so quick to judge, so ready to condemn, so eager to dismiss. He had allowed his prejudices to cloud his judgment, blinding him to the truth. He had failed to see the humanity in Reverend Jackson, the kindness in his heart, the compassion in his soul. The revelation was devastating, a shattering of his self-perception, a dismantling of his carefully constructed worldview. He had always considered himself a man of principle, a man of integrity. But now, confronted with the truth, he saw himself for what he was, a prejudiced man, a bigoted man, a cruel man. He felt a deep sense of regret, a profound remorse that gnawed at his soul. He had wronged Reverend Jackson, and he had wronged his own mother. He had rejected the kindness and compassion that had been offered to him, and he had inflicted pain and suffering on an innocent man. The shame was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to break him. He felt the need to confess, to apologize, to seek forgiveness. He knew that the path to redemption would be long and arduous, but he also knew that it was the only path forward. He had to find a way to make amends, to repair the damage he had caused, to reconcile with the man he had so unjustly wronged. The revelation had been painful, but it had also been liberating. It had stripped away his illusions, exposing the ugliness of his prejudice and the depth of his own hypocrisy. It had also opened the door to a path of healing, a journey towards redemption. The funeral concluded, leaving Silas Abernathy in a state of profound remorse. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, the shame of his prejudice a heavy burden to bear. He watched as Reverend Jackson spoke to mourners, his words gentle and compassionate, his presence a beacon of hope and understanding. The contrast between Reverend Jackson's kindness and his own cruelty was stark and unbearable. He knew he couldn't continue living with this burden. He had to make amends, to seek forgiveness. He had to confront Reverend Jackson, to apologize for his actions, to confess his prejudice. The thought filled him with a mixture of dread and determination. He found Reverend Jackson standing alone near the church entrance, his expression somber but peaceful. Silas approached him, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling slightly. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. "Reverend Jackson," he began, his voice barely a whisper. The words caught in his throat, the weight of his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Reverend Jackson turned, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized Silas. He didn't speak, but his expression was one of quiet understanding, a recognition of the turmoil that Silas was experiencing. I need to apologize," Silas stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For the eviction, for my behavior, for my prejudice." He paused, struggling to find the words to express the depth of his remorse. He felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, the shame of his prejudice a heavy burden to bear. I didn't realize," Silas continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't understand. I was blinded by my own ignorance, my own fear." He confessed his prejudice, his unfounded assumptions, his irrational fear of the other. He spoke of his own upbringing, his own ingrained biases, his own failure to see the humanity in others. He spoke of his regret, his shame, his profound remorse. Reverend Jackson listened patiently, his expression calm and understanding. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't condemn. He simply listened, offering Silas the space to confess his sins, to acknowledge his failings, to express his remorse. When Silas had finished speaking, a silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. Then, Reverend Jackson spoke, his voice gentle and compassionate. "I accept your apology, Silas," he said. "But forgiveness is not just about me. It's about you, about your own journey towards redemption. It's about learning from your mistakes, confronting your prejudices, and making amends for the harm you've caused." Silas nodded, tears streaming down his face. He felt a sense of relief, a release of the burden he had been carrying. He knew that his journey towards redemption would be long and arduous, but he also knew that he was not alone. He had Reverend Jackson's understanding, his compassion, his forgiveness. And that, he realized, was the first step towards healing. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was ready to begin. The apology marked a turning point, not just for Silas Abernathy, but for the entire community. Reverend Jackson's forgiveness, offered with grace and understanding, was a powerful act of reconciliation. It was a testament to his faith, his compassion, and his unwavering belief in the power of redemption. Silas, humbled and remorseful, took concrete steps to make amends. He publicly apologized for his actions, admitting his prejudice and vowing to fight against discrimination in the future. He worked with the community to create an anti-discrimination policy for his building, ensuring that such injustices would never happen again. He also made a substantial donation to a local charity that supported affordable housing initiatives. The incident, initially a source of division and anger, became a catalyst for community healing. People who had been hesitant to speak out against discrimination now found their voices, sharing their own experiences and demanding change. The community organized workshops and discussions on prejudice and tolerance, fostering dialogue and understanding. The shared experience of overcoming injustice brought people closer together, strengthening the bonds of community and fostering a sense of collective responsibility. Reverend Jackson's story became a symbol of hope and resilience. His unwavering faith, his commitment to justice, and his willingness to forgive inspired others to confront their own prejudices and work towards a more equitable society. His actions demonstrated the power of forgiveness, the transformative potential of compassion, and the importance of reconciliation. The local media continued to cover the story, highlighting the community's response and the positive changes that were taking place. The incident became a case study in community healing, demonstrating the power of collective action and the importance of addressing systemic inequalities. Silas's transformation became a testament to the possibility of redemption, a beacon of hope for those who had been wronged and a challenge to those who perpetuated injustice. The town held a community event to celebrate the reconciliation and the positive changes that had occurred. Reverend Jackson and Silas Abernathy stood side by side, their shared presence a symbol of hope and unity. They spoke of their experiences, their struggles, and their shared journey towards healing. Their words resonated deeply with the community, inspiring others to confront their own prejudices and work towards a more just and equitable society. The incident served as a powerful reminder that forgiveness is not about condoning wrongdoing, but about releasing the burden of resentment and creating space for healing and reconciliation. It was a testament to the power of human connection, the transformative potential of compassion, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The community emerged stronger, more united, and more committed to building a future where justice, compassion, and understanding would prevail. The story of Reverend Jackson and Silas Abernathy became a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope, forgiveness, and redemption are always possible.